to the first stop that really prompted us to go with a business-themed history tour this year, Commercial Press. In 2020, they turned 50 years old, and we were planning to do this in 2020, but, you know, coronavirus. So, Commercial Press started with a man named Bill Grin, who's still the original owner and operator. He started off in Stroudsburg as a printer in 1958, but he always had in mind to eventually open up and operate his own shop. So, when an opportunity came in 1970, he took it. See, he heard about this shop in Manhattan that was closing down and selling their parts and their equipment. See, he heard of this shop that was going to close down and sell their equipment, and it was in Manhattan, Kansas. Manhattan, Kansas is a city about 17 to 18 hours west of here. So initially, Bill and his wife Sue flew over to check the place out, see if there was a possibility. And then Bill and a friend of his took 2 truckloads of equipment back with them to Virginia. So first they opened up at the old telephone office up the street from here, where we now have the model store. But in 1979, they moved to their current location. With that said, at the time, there was a vacant dry cleaners on that section of the building there. This time, they've expanded to fill the entire place. Partnerships have always been critical to the success of Commercial Press. In fact, when Bill first opened this place, there was a business in Winchester that said, hey, we will make you our sole print shop. And they've held true to the word. They've been loyal customers ever since. Probably in part because, for their part, Commercial Press has also been a very loyal customer and partner to work with. The company always tries to be accommodating and do whatever their customers are asking them to do, within reason, of course. Even then, if there's a tougher job that may not seem very plausible, they'll still try and see if they can get it done. They also show a lot of loyalty to their employees. In fact, many of the employees here have been here for about 30 years. And they'll even partner with other printing presses to do work they couldn't do simply on their own. When we asked Bill about the secret of maintaining such good partnerships, he said honesty is key. You get partners, you get loyalty, you get trust by being honest with folks. That means talking straight about what you can do, what you can't do, and keeping good to your word so when you say you're going to do something, you get it done. That said, Commercial Press has seen a lot of changes over the years. When they first started, they had a letterhead press. Now, that was electrified, but letterhead is still the same kind that Gutenberg used to print a Bible about 600 years ago. After that, they switched to overhead press, and now they're using digital. So imagine if it would be like going from a wind-powered mill to a steam-powered mill, all within a few decades. That's the kind of thing they've had to deal with here and to adapt with. They've kept up with the latest technology, but they'll still use some of the older overhead press equipment when it suits them. After all, they already paid for it. So, between using some timeless values of trust and respect and loyalty, and also using the latest technology, Commercial Press has managed to make itself a timeless business in town. They now have partners from Harrisonburg to Martinsburg with no signs of slowing down. So, have you heard that history is all about rich and famous, the guys who win, dead white guys, whatever? Well, first of all, the reality that it's more complicated, so that's kind of wrong. And second, today we're not going to be talking about those guys. Today we're going to be talking about ordinary people, men and women, white and black, who had to work for a living. Welcome to Muddy. 4 years after the Civil War shook Newtown, another change happened that had much more profound, lasting influence on the town. A railroad came in. This railroad changed everything. For example, if you were to go to the Steel & Brothers store exhibit at the museum, you could see a box of beef from Argentina. Now, Buenos Aires is about a quarter of the distance away around the world from, say, Baltimore. And after sailing that beef 1/4 of the way around the world, and you get it off at Baltimore, before a railroad, it'd be coming here by covered wagon. On a good day, a covered wagon makes about 15 miles. So from Baltimore to here by wagon, you're looking at about a week or more before the beef reaches. Let me know if you want to eat week-old beef. Granted, to be fair, it probably wasn't pickled or salted or smoked or otherwise preserved, but it's not going to be fresh. By contrast, I spent some time trying to figure out how fast the early railroads could go, and I wasn't able to get an exact number, except that during the Civil War, when there's less maintenance and less care put on them, so they're going slower, it was 10 miles an hour. That includes stops. So, during prime time, peacetime, when everyone's on top of their game, they could go much, much faster. And even then, 15 miles a day versus 10 miles an hour, there's no competition. Now, especially if you have a refrigerated rail car that can keep that beef fresh, you can get fresh beef from Argentina. What's that bottom line for us? Well, Newtown has made its living off the covered wagon. Not only going up and down the wagon road, which is our main street and became Route 11, but also on making and repairing covered wagons. So with those factors gone and going out of the way, people aren't going to use wagons as much as they used to. And that's going to change the town's industry. A lot of highly skilled artisans, white and black, lost their jobs along the way when the railroad came. So we're looking at jobs that were lost in Newtown, and not just for the wagon makers. We're talking about the blacksmiths who worked with the wagon makers. We're talking about the wheelwrights, carpenters who worked with them. We lost the whole industry. On the other hand, the railroad created whole industries for the town. We had a lime quarry and a lime plant. I'm going to get to them later. We had a mill. We had a cider works. We had a vinegar plant. We had employee housing for all those move in. We had a general store for them move in. We had restaurants for them move in. So it eventually created this entire area around here called Mudville, named that way because of the condition of the road. And it became pretty much as big as the rest of Stevens City at its height. For 120 years, Mudville brought prosperity to the town. And the single biggest employer in industry was the M.J. Grove Lime Works. This lime works had two components. There was the quarry that gets the limestone out of the ground, and the kiln for refining. These structures back here that I get a lot of questions about are remnants of the old lime kiln. The industry here was so big, it actually changed the landscape. If you look at a satellite image of Stevens City, you will see lakes on the west side of town. Those did not exist before lime quarry. Those are where we dug limestone out of the ground and water came in to fill its place. This was also an integrated work environment with white and black men working alongside each other. That was pretty forward thinking for the time, but it wasn't necessarily equal. See, black men earned less than white men doing the same work, and the white men actually didn't make that good a set of wages in the first place. In fact, a longtime resident of Mudville named John Holt recalls several white welders left to work elsewhere because they could find better wages without too much trouble. You can imagine what it was like for black workers here and the kind of wages they earned. Things could have been worse, though. We have an account from an African-American man named Theodore Medley who lived here as a young man. He said this was the best place he ever lived, including Pittsburgh and other parts of the Shenandoah Valley. Theodore described a pretty low bar, though. See, when he said this was the best place he ever lived, the examples he gave were that nobody ever tried to fight him over the color of his skin. Nobody ever called him the N-word. This was the Jim Crow era we're talking about. It just wasn't a great time in our country's history. Complete shift of gears, though. Mudville experienced the start of its decline in 1936 with a massive fire that broke out in roughly this general direction. In In 2020 dollars, this fire produced about $900,000 in damage. The businesses that were affected had insurance, but not enough to cover all the damages. While they were mostly able to recover, they weren't as strong as they were before the fire, even for decades thereafter. More decline for Mudville came in a couple other decades, in the 1950s. Transportation with the railroad made Mudville, and transportation could also destroy it. See, trucks started to replace trains as the main method of transportation, especially for goods. Now when that happened, Route 11 started to become important again. And when more traffic came on Route 11, the relevance of a lot of businesses here in Mudville started to decline. Passenger service on the train stopped in 1952. That also means that all of the human services, the restaurant and such, we're also going to see declining business. And when Interstate 81 opened in the 1960s, it just shifted truck traffic even further away from Mudville onto 81 off of Main Street. Slowly, businesses here started to whittle away until very little was left. The Lime Works was the last one to go. Starting in the 1980s, they stopped quarrying, mainly because the cost of pumping water out of the ground to keep the quarry going just became too much for what they were getting out of the ground in value. So the lime works continued to have a refining process up until the early 2000s, when that was also no longer profitable. And the lime works shut down for good. With that said, Mudville is not entirely gone. We still have some industries here. The most prominent one, quite possibly being Woodgate Petroleum, up across from where I am now. They'll still make deliveries on the railroad track, which is still active for cargo use. So in some ways, Stevens City still has industry as part of its heart and soul. We understand a lot of people come to town to buy used items. We hear about it so much, actually. We came here to Main Street Classics and started asking some questions. We'll start with this store's history. It was opened by a woman named Debbie Jo. She'd been around antiques her whole life. So when she retired in 2012, she opened up an antique store. Originally, it was the Wembley building. It's about 2 blocks north of here. Then in 2015, she moved into the little strip mall, Caddy Corner here, before finally moving here in 2017. Now, when Debbie Jo moved in, there was a little situation. Stonewall Antiques was already here. Keep in mind, though, I said a situation, not a problem. See, they just partnered with Stonewall, and they've been on good terms ever since. This building itself was perfect. You see, it's built like a labyrinth, and it's real easy to get lost in here. And for people who are antiquing enthusiasts, that's wonderful. They love being able to get in there and crawl around and make searches and discoveries. So building that's wide open where you can see everything right away, kind of boring to them. She also found that the town's historic district was really helpful for giving an atmosphere that was also conducive to her trade. The town's had antique stores longer than 9 years, though. We've actually had them for decades. This goes back at least as far as Harold's Antique Store. They existed in the 1950s, way up over where Fritz's Furniture was. They were neighbors. Now, since then, the Harold's location has been taken over by what's turned into Stevens City Outlet, which we'll see later in the tour. But that wasn't the only one. So Harold's opened up in the 1950s as a neighbor to Fritz's Furniture. Now, so in addition to Harold's, there's also Bill Harold's, which also operated in the Wembley building, which is where Main Street Classics got started. There was Schrock's, which operated at the old bank building you see at the light. And longtime mayor Ray Ewing also operated an antique store at the Wembley building for a couple of years as well. So our town's had a lot of antique and secondhand stores over the years, but people are saying that antiquing's in the decline. Mayor Ray Ewing, he said part of the reason why he closed the store is because it wasn't really doing enough business, although a bigger reason is that he got married and moved to Winchester instead. So with that said, why is it that Main Street Classics is able to succeed? What's going on? Well, Debbie had a few ideas. First, location again. Three for three antique stores at the Wembley building have either closed or moved out. So a building like that, where the ultrasound facility is, has a great layout for an ultrasound facility, not so much for an antique store where people want to get lost. It's probably no coincidence that the secondhand store across the street, which is also built like a labyrinth, as another longtime mainstay of the antiquing and secondhand business in town. For another, Debbie makes sure that she finds partners who count. There are a lot of partners who sell their items at Main Street Classics. With each and every single one, Debbie makes sure that they are people who either sell quality goods that are heirlooms and are going to stay classic and relevant through time, or they're in a style that is suitable for niche markets. She also mentioned that sort of a distinction between antiques and secondhand. Secondhand items are used, but that's the extent of it. They're used. Antiques are ones that have a little more timelessness to them. Debbie also sees a lot of her customers as partners as well. She has two sets of customers. There's the older ones and the younger ones. The older customers mostly come here to reminisce and socialize, and the younger ones mostly come here to spend money, particularly on those kind of classic items that are going to be sturdy and last for a long time. They appreciate both kinds of customers. The other thing that contributes to this building's success, to this business's success, is that Debbie is retired. I mean, she doesn't have to make as much money as somebody who's in their 30s. It's a way for her to keep occupied during her retirement and have some side income. Now, I did ask Main Street Classics what their biggest struggle was, and ironically, given how some folks talk about antiquing being a big thing in town, it's that people actually don't know where this place is. But, now you know, so why not stop in, see if there's anything you like. So the origins of this place are a bit foggy since it goes back to colonial times. But we think the guy who started this town, Louis Stevens, built it sometime in the 1730s. And when he did that, it was actually built as a tavern building. Now, if you were on a previous tour, you would know that when I say tavern, I don't mean sports bar so much as a cross between a hotel and, I guess, a Denny's, someplace where you could rest for the night, get food, get drink, rest your horses or whatever animals you had, and move on for the next day. You would also know that the main museum building across the street from here was also a tavern. It actually makes sense. The intersection was pretty busy, as it still kind of is, so having a couple taverns across the street from each other would be like having multiple hotels at the airport. Now, something does change with time, though. By the Civil War, the museum's tavern got called a hotel, which means there was an upgrade in the quality. By the War of 1812, this tavern isn't getting an upgrade in that way, but they're also becoming what's called a general store, sort of a proto-Walmart, where you can buy a little bit of everything. And this building, over time, will become less a tavern and more general. Actually, the fact that it's a flower center probably helps in the modern day. See, if this was still a hotel, it would have to deal with some big corporate hotel chains. If it was still a general store or a drugstore, it would have to deal with big box retailers or national pharmacy chains. But the only kind of corporate competition a flower center gets is that little section you see at Martin's. So what that goes to show is that with the 3 centuries of successful businesses here, each one has had a strategic mindset, providing something that is important to people in the area, but also can fit the capacities of the time. As a busy intersection, this was an ideal place for a tavern. It was also an ideal place for a general store for people traveling by to buy things. Now that we have busier roads like the interstate highways and other federal highway systems, and we have bigger corporations to deal with, it makes sense for this small corner to have a family business instead. So as long as people who are establishing businesses here are thinking strategically about the needs of the community, we can expect to see a continued history of successful business at this corner. Most of the original building is actually gone though. What you see here with the stone and the flat roof and all that, that actually goes back to the 1920s when there's a massive renovation. An irony of this renovation is that this architectural style, called the Italianate, was actually popular around the time of the Civil War. So you get this 1920s renovation that actually is a throwback in style. But it still kind of looks good, so hey, if it works. Now with that said, if you do want to see the original part of the building, you actually have to go to the north side. Over there you'll see some brick. And that brickwork will show you even some of the original windows, so you can see them if you look real carefully. So also, after this 1920s renovation, this actually became the site of the Southern States. And it stayed the Southern States until that actually moved further up the street later on. After the Southern States, there was a drugstore, the Baptist drugstore. It actually wasn't religious. The guy who ran it was actually Dr. Baptist. It was actually a kind of drugstore you see in sort of like the old Archie comics, you know. It had a soda fountain and was like the kind you would expect to see in the middle of the 20th century. The renovation also brought a couple of apartments on the second floor, which are still there today. After it was the Baptist drugstore, it became Dr. Horner's drugstore, and that lasted for a while. Then it was a Christian youth center for about a year. And then starting in the 1970s, that's when the Flower Center moved in. Now, the Flower Center got the benefit from effectively a lack of corporate competition. Okay, now we're going to try and talk about 3 stops in 1 tour. Why? Because they're all right here. We'll mostly be talking about Gregory's though. Gregory's is the most prominent because they've been in business actually for 70 years now. It's going to be 69, but with the year's delay, rounds up to a nice even number for them. Gregory's did not start at this building though. Instead, Lee Gregory started selling all kinds of things out of the trunk of his car in 1951. He also worked for an appliance salesman. And he soon carved out a specialty with appliances, storm windows, and storm doors. From there, Lee expanded to selling all kinds of things, from roofing to siding. Some of these things he sold are still around, like Maytag washers. Others, like Admiral TVs, have gone the way of floppy disks, rotary phones, VHS. Storm windows, storm doors, and other household fixtures really took off though because people really wanted those. When Gregory first started selling storm windows and doors, they were new inventions. Nobody had them, everyone wanted them, it was good business. In 1965, Lee handed the business over to his brother Ralph. Ralph had been with him for a while, mostly doing TV repairs. By that point, they'd also moved into the current building. Now before that, it was a movie theater. Kind of get an idea from the way it's laid out, you know? Before it was a movie theater, there was an Opry House. Again, kind of gives you a venue setting. Gregory still sells household fixtures, especially for homes built before World War II. They have adapted with time, though, by going from, say, selling storm windows to instead replacement windows. And they're active in a 50 to 75 mile radius around Stevens City. By focusing on items of the kind that they do, they're even able to compete with big box retail. And they guarantee that when you call them, you get a person, not a robot. This doesn't mean that the company hasn't had its challenges, though. The single biggest problem they have is trying to compete with some of the local areas like DC and Nova for skilled workers. The high wages over that way tend to poach a lot of talent out of the locality and out of the valley. Ralph and his wife Carolyn have countered this by raising their sons up to do a lot of the business, and in fact today they do run a lot of it. So it does look like the Gregory's legacy is secure for the moment. This tan and blue building here started as the E.L. Wembley Store in 1901. They went with the general theme of having a general store on the first floor and an opry house on the second. Both sections of the building stayed with those general themes, with the downstairs being various types of stores over the years, and the upstairs being a ballroom, a movie theater, or some other entertainment thing. You see this store here? It might be the busiest store in town. It didn't actually start as a store though. It originally started as the People's Bank at Stevens City. People's Bank opened up right here in 1906. Now, I don't mean there. That is its third and final location, right about here. The side of the building that's closest to the church, that's about where the original Stevens City Bank, or People's Bank of Stevens City was. Now, the bank didn't just house the bank. It also housed a meeting space for a lot of fraternal organizations. These were pretty important back in the day. See, there's a time when life, health, and disability insurance weren't really accessible, especially to the working class. Fraternal organizations not only gave these working class folks a chance to socialize, it also would give them a chance to pool their resources in case of some kind of workplace-related accident, including ones that could result in a loss of life. Then in 1924, the bank moved down the street to the red brick building at the corner. And when that happened, Spitzer's Furniture Store moved in instead. Spitzer's did really well. They were here for decades, and they kept expanding their building this way. You may remember that I mentioned Harold's Antiques earlier. It was right around this area. That got eaten up and taken over by Spitzer's Furniture when they did their expansion in the 1970s. That same expansion brought the neon sign you see here. Only, of course, it said Spitzer's Furniture instead of Stevens City Outlets. Spitzer's closed around the beginning of the 21st century. The building was vacant for a few years, and then the Stevens City Outlets moved in. The Outlets originally had been about where the ultrasound clinic is, Lemley's building again, and they'd also operated a women's clothes store in the red brick building across the street. But they got this building from Glenn Burke about 19 years ago, and we're glad to see it put to good use again. The second business that had a special anniversary in 2020. Welcome to Plums Garage. Plums started in 1945, so last year they turned 75, now they're 76. We're happy to still be celebrating them nonetheless. And Clem started with Richard Clem. He began the business actually in his backyard, in a garage that was basically across the street from the fire department. By the 1950s, the Clem family was ready to move up here. So they did. They got to the top of the hill, they put in a little convenience store, they put in some gas pumps, and they also had a small garage and a car lot in the back. The family also liked being able to be real close to work, so they all moved up the hill as well, and called this area Clemsville, because the family still lives in the vicinity of the shop. And I gotta say, if you operate a 24-hour towing business, it's a lot easier to go to work for a 3 a.m. call when you live basically right next door to where you gotta go to work. Speaking of towing, that business actually started in the 1960s. Back then, they were actually towing a lot of tractors, because even more so than today, this is a big farming area. 60s brought some other towing business too. That was the decade that the interstate highway came in. The Clems actually moved a couple houses out of the way. And when I say that, I mean they literally jacked the houses up, put them on a vehicle, and drove them out of the way of the incoming highway. Of course, once the highway opened up, they had a lot more routine towing business as well, the kind that we're used to seeing them drive around town. towing did force some changes to the family's way of doing business, though. At first, everyone had a set role. One person does towing, one person does the auto shop, one person runs the store. But as towing got busier and busier, it became pretty unfair to put all that on one person. So now what they do is everyone still has an assigned role, but they rotate who's doing the tow truck. Now, only time of year when nobody's on call, nobody's doing tow, and everyone in the family can definitely spend time together, is 4th of July. And in the family business, they found it's not just the family that affects the business, in the family business, they found that it's not just the business that affects the family can also affect the business. They learned this years ago. In a family business, the Plums learned that it's not just the business that affects the family, though. The family also affects the business. See, at one point, the grandmother of the family had a protracted illness, and her medication was getting pretty expensive. So they could afford to either pay for grandma's medication or pay to continue having fuel at pumps. They chose their grandmother's medication, and that ended the fuel business. This wasn't the only time the family ended an element of business. I mean, it's always been multifaceted. But in order to stay competitive, they always look at all the different bits of business they do, and if something starts to become unprofitable, they phase it out. Another example of that was the convenience store that used to be right here. And that store, it's actually been an interesting story to it, because back when they were towing tractors all the time, and this was a big farming area, farmers would actually come to the store at the end of the day to drink soda and unwind. But hey, times change. Adaptability is not the only thing the family has used to keep their business going strong, though. They've also had good community ties that have been a real asset to them. Those farmers who used to come here and drink soda and unwind, well, they're not doing that anymore, but their descendants, even the ones who aren't farmers anymore, still live in the area and still know the Plums family name for auto services and still trust the family to do good work. So because of that, they have a pretty loyal customer base. The family's strength as a family has also helped. I mean, if you're going to spend as much time with each other as they do, constantly working together, while also only getting one day off together as a family each year, you got to get along. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty tough to operate. So as it is, the kids, when they grow up, going to get jobs here, and even people who've married in have gotten jobs here. Today, the towing service has 8 drivers. They've gone as far as Knoxville, the Carolinas, and Philadelphia. This struck me as a local historian because the old wagon road that Route 11 runs on happened to used to go to Knoxville, the Carolinas, and Philadelphia. It's like some things have never changed. They do face some challenges, though. The 2 biggest ones are trying to find qualified employees and workman's comp. Now, trying to find qualified employees, it does help if they bring in so many members of the family and they do a good job. But if you need additional help outside that, they're dealing with the same problem as stragglers, where people want to go over the mountains and find high-paying jobs over in the D.C. area. With that said, Billy Clem said that anyone can make a decent living as a mechanic if they're reasonably competent and they're willing to observe the work and learn on the job. With workman's comp, the situation's a little more grim. See, workman's comp for driving a tow truck is getting more and more expensive as everyone gets more and more of these and other distractions, and distracted drivers become more common. If there's one thing you take away from this entire tour, whether it's this stop or any of the others, is that Billy Plum said, please pay attention when you're driving. If you see flashing yellow lights on the side of the road, move over if you can or slow down. That means somebody is trying to get out of the vehicle to do service work, including towing away. Thankfully, nobody from the Plums family has been hurt on the job because of a distracted driver. I'm sure we all want to keep it that way. You may have noticed that Stephen City gets more trucks than most places. Well, Here's the reason why. Welcome to High Point Truck Stop. First, may as well get this out of the way. You're probably wondering if High Point Truck Stop has anything to do with High Point Diner behind me over there. The answer is actually no. The only thing they have in common is the name. But they have different owners, they're on different property lots, and they have different histories. We don't know the exact point when the High Point Truck Stop began, but we know who started, the Cook family. See, they owned this property here in the 1930s and 40s. When they bought it in 1936, the deed makes no mention of a High Point of any kind. But when they sold it 5 years later, there was mention of High Point. So sometime in that 5-year span, this got started. Now by the 1950s, this stop was owned by a woman named Rhoda Mae Kemp. And she leased it out to a couple of businessmen, entrepreneurs out of the Richmond area named Gerald and Glancy. They owned truck stops that went along Route 1 from Richmond up to about Doswell, where King's Dominion is. And they were very much in the business of trying to get as much traffic and money and income through here as possible. While I lived in the Richmond area, they'd swing by once a week just to see how things are going here. And they bought up a lot of contracts with nationwide trucking companies to make this a primary truck stop. Even so, when Interstate 81 opened in 1964, John Glancy sold this stop to someone else. They knew that 81 was going to be competition for the business, and I guess they didn't want to deal with it, so all their full-time energy down to the Richmond area. The next tenant was then H.N. Funkhauser, which managed the truck stop after John Glancy left, and then they bought it outright in 1970. H.N. Funkhauser quickly learned that the new truck stop they owned came with certain public relations problems. You see, in the process of getting as much traffic in here as possible, John Glancy had generated some practices that weren't always appreciated by the neighbors. So in the meantime, H.N. Funkhauser learned that some of John Glancy's changes and expansions to High Point weren't really appreciated by the neighbors. See, in the process of getting as many trucks and as many companies in here as possible, this place becomes very loud. And there are a few factors compounding it. One, it operated 24 hours a day. So if you can imagine truck noise at all hours of day and night, that's one of the factors here. Two, some of those trucks had livestock. So if you can imagine pigs and cows and other livestock carrying on in the middle of it all, that was also a factor. And they operated a mechanic shop, which, since the truck stop operated 24 hours, also operated 24 hours itself. And the last bit of fun, to top it all off, there was no blacktop. Everything we see here that's asphalt or concrete was dirt and dust. You can imagine Will's like to be a neighbor of this place, with noise at all hours of the day and constant dust clouds. H.N. Funkhauser realized this to be a problem when some folks actually ran for mayor on platform of shutting down High Point. So they made some changes. First of all, well, you can see this isn't dirt anymore. Second, trucks basically stop at 10 p.m., quiet hours. Third, no more livestock because cows don't appreciate the meaning of quiet hours. And fourth, there's not a mechanic shop here anymore. This did cause a reduction in business, but in some ways it actually kind of worked out. See, when Interstate 81 came in, the main truck highway went from being Route 11 on Main Street to one over there where trucks are going to go much faster and we're probably going to just pass by the town altogether. most of the contracts that they sold off were for nationwide trucking chains that, well, probably wouldn't have been too interested in stopping here anyway. It may have actually been saving grace to help keep the place going. In the meantime, those contracts went down to a truck stop called the Virginian outside of Tom's Brook. And if you go down to Tom's Brook, you'll see a couple truck stops there today. One of those is a corporate chain that probably replaced the Virginia. So then who does come here? Locals. Most of the truckers who come here and they come to stop for the night are probably going to stop home for the night as well and sleep overnight at home rather than being on the road. Despite the fact that dropping the national chains and focusing on more locality may have saved High Point, they still do struggle to compete with some of the big national chains you see along the side of the highway for truckers who are going across multiple states and who aren't local. So with that in mind, they actually have the property here split up in multiple lots like they were originally, rather than consolidating it all into one big lot, even though this business has been around for decades. And it makes sense. If there's one thing that's clear on this tour, it's that nothing lasts forever. If there's another thing that's clear, it's that having a small business in a small town can be pretty tough. But if you focus on what that town needs, and if you focus on the strengths of a community in a small town, you can do pretty well. So, if anyone's looking to maybe open up a business in Stevens City, as long as they're willing to think strategically about what they have and what they could use, they got a pretty good shot at making something.